recording started. All right. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jill Jarris with Alison Brown. We are the hosts of Keep the Flame Alive, the podcast for fans of the Olympics and Paralympics. We are so excited tonight to talk with New York Times bestselling author Andrew Maraniss about his fourth book called Inaugural Ballers, the true story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, which was our first book club title for 2023. We have a book club on the podcast. This is not Andrew's first visit to our podcast country called Shukflistan. Our book club also read his second book called Games of Deception, the true story of the first U.S. Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Germany. Andrew's work has won numerous awards, and his family has good ties with Shukflistan. His father, Pulitzer Prize winner David Maraniss, has also been featured on our podcast for some of his Olympic-related books. So, Andrew, welcome. We're excited to have you. First off, after writing about men's basketball for the Olympics, what inspired you to write about the women's side?
Great question. And I have a fun answer to that question. And first of all, though, thank you for having me on and for including the book in your book club. That really means a lot to me. So I was at Lexington Trails Middle School in DeSoto, Kansas, to talk about Games of Deception, because, as you know, half of that first men's Olympic basketball team was from the state of Kansas. And so for me, my books are considered young adult books, although adults read them too. And but as part of the young adult side, I feel like it's important to visit kids and high schools and middle schools. And so with that book, I really wanted to get out to Kansas and speak as many schools as I could there. And so this was one of those school visits. And I gave a presentation about the first men's Olympic basketball team. And at the end, like there is at every school, there's a Q&A with the students. And there was a young woman in 8th grade named Maddie, who stood up and said, well, you've told us the first story of the first men's team. What's the first story of the first women's team? And so it was standing there in the middle school in DeSoto, Kansas, that she came up with that question. And it really got me to thinking that I had been wanting to do a story about women's sports because my first 3 books were all on men's sports. Hadn't really settled on a topic yet. And when she posed that question, I realized, well, let me look into that, and when discovered that the team played, I wasn't even really aware of when the first women's Olympic basketball tournament was. When found out it was in 76, and that you could tell a story in the context of the women's rights movement of the 1970s and Title IX, and that the 50th anniversary of Title IX was quickly approaching, it seemed like the right time to do it, and a story that I would be interested in writing.
Do you remember 1976 at all?
I do. So I was 6 years old. That's the first Olympics that I do remember a little bit. I remember Nadia most of all. So, it was women's sports that I remember from those Olympics. We lived in New Jersey at the time. And I think I remember Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner a little bit from those Olympics. But really, it was Nadia. And honestly, I think she was my first crush as a 6-year-old. Out there when getting her perfect 10s in those Olympics. I didn't remember basketball from those Olympics at all.
Were you surprised at the gap in between when the men started and when the women started?
Yeah, 40 years is pretty incredible. And one of the things that I discovered when I was researching actually the first book, the Games of Deception book, was that women were playing basketball from the very beginning. Of course, it wasn't that they just started playing basketball in 1976, but really they were playing from a week after the game was invented at Springfield College. You could say the first basketball fans in the world were women. They were school teachers at Buckingham Elementary School, which was just a couple blocks away from the YMCA training school where James Naismith invented the game. They heard this commotion. They came and watched some of those very first games. And then they asked Naismith if they could play too, and that's an important question in history. Like, how was he going to answer that? And he said he didn't see why not, and so those school teachers played the first basketball game for women. And then it was Senda Berenson, who was a physical education professor at Smith College, that introduced basketball there and really would be considered like the mother of basketball. But you saw women's basketball go through ups and downs. It wasn't like a steady rise from the 1890s to 1976. There were periods where women's basketball was played, at a lot of schools, was popular, was supported, typically mirroring like other social advances for women in society. So the late 19-teens, 1920s, women gained the right to vote, and women's basketball is really popular. Then after Great Depression, society becomes a little more conservative, and women's basketball is dropped at a lot of colleges. World War II, I write in the book, if Rosie Riveter can build an airplane, she can play basketball too, right? So you start to see women's basketball become more accepted again and more popular in the mid-late 40s. Then society becomes more conservative again in the 50s, and women's basketball, women are told, you shouldn't sweat, you shouldn't have muscles, it's not ladylike, to play sports. And then again in the late 60s, early 70s, women's liberation, ERA, Title IX, all these things are happening, and women's basketball comes back, and that's when you see it appear in the Olympics for the first time.
So we talk about this on the show a fair amount with the delay in adding women's sports to the games. Was there a big worry about their uteruses falling out?
Yes. Just ridiculous things like that. I talked to Mildred Barnes, who's now in her 90s. She's still active, like pickleball champion, but back in the 40s and 50s, she was playing field hockey, which has a larger field than a basketball court and no timeouts, and she's like, why did they think our uteruses were going to fall out playing basketball when they weren't falling out playing field hockey? It was pretty ridiculous any way you think about it. And really, the idea that these restrictions were meant to protect women was the exact opposite of the truth. It was really, I think, to protect the fragile egos of men, that women could actually be athletic and be competitive and play well, and that maybe that hurt the egos of some men that were threatened by that.
In your book, you touch on so many different things like Title IX and the women players' fears of how they were perceived. And so many of those issues are still true in women's sports today. And how did it feel just in terms of seeing, oh my God, things haven't changed since 76?
Yeah. I work in an athletic department at Vanderbilt University, and my boss is Candace Lee, who played basketball at Vanderbilt. I'm around the women student athletes at our campus every day and see how hard they work. And yet I think the story last year, when everyone was celebrating the 50th anniversary of Title IX, was, yes, there's been tremendous changes over the last 50 years and for the better, but there's also a lot yet to be done, to be still accomplished. And I think one of the themes of this book that came through pretty strongly from all the women I interviewed from that era of the 1970s was that it's kind of a relay race, and they took a baton from women that came before them, and they understood what previous generations had done. And they went so far, but then they handed that baton to another generation that still has its own challenges to face, and that it's never really over, or at least it won't be for a long time, And so for me, I think the biggest thing that I notice in terms of an inequity is attendance. I get so frustrated when I go to a men's basketball game and there's 10,000 people there, and then the next day there's a women's game and there's 1,000 people there, and that's not an equitable experience. I know it's not that. There's some places where, women's basketball is selling out or women's volleyball is selling out, but for the most part, there's a pretty big disparity typically at most colleges or high schools between men's and women's games. I think, you see when this 1976 basketball team came along, their coach told them, Billy Moore said in the locker room before the silver medal game, that if they won the game, it would change women's sports in this country for the next 25 years. And she was right about that. It's during that 25-year period where you see women's scholarships in sports come along. NCAA start to administer women's sports, for better or worse. Professional sports leagues for women, WNBA, for example, start, and even soccer. I think now when we think of the most powerful, popular team sport at a national level in the U.S., it would probably be the women's soccer team. And there was no Women's World Cup in 1976. There was no women's Olympic soccer in 1976. So these women really paved the way, not just for their own sport, for other sports too. And now you see women with large platforms, to fight for social change, which, on one hand is great. They have the platform. On the other hand, it's sad that they still have these issues to face, like in soccer, for example, with pay equity. Women's basketball, you saw WNBA players involved in the Senate race in Georgia, which turned that race and changed the makeup of the Senate. So, I mean, I think in some ways, the idea that women athletes have these platforms and have a voice and are more powerful is a positive. And the other way, they're having to use this voice because there's so many things that are yet to have changed.
On that, go ahead, Jill.
I was going to say, on kind of on that note, what do your audiences see as you traveled around and talk with schools? What do the girls react to when you talk about, yeah, this is the way it was, and it was great when we read the book. We loved how much context you put of the women's movement within this book, and I thought it was really effective to kind of show your readers where things were and where they've come. But what are they experiencing now, and what were their reactions when they read this?
Yeah, I was just at a junior college basketball tournament last week. It's a long phrase, but it was the National Junior College Athletic Association Division II Women's Basketball Championships at St. Clair County Community College in Port Huron, Michigan. So the top 16 D2 junior college women's basketball teams were there to play for their championship. And at the opening banquet, I had a chance to be part of a discussion with Julian Simpson, who was the co-captain of the 76 Olympic team, and Carolyn Bush Roddy, who was the last player cut from that team and been part of the U.S. national team in years prior. And it was really heartwarming to see the way that the young women on the college teams now gravitated to Julian and Carolyn and were really interested in hearing their stories, not just about the Olympics, but about being an athlete at that point in history, and really seemed to appreciate the history that they were learning, and taking inspiration from that and asking for pictures and autographs. And I love seeing that at the younger level. When I've spoken about this book at middle schools and high schools, the boys and the girls are surprised when they learn that a lot of schools didn't offer sports for girls, or that the girls didn't get access to the gym, for PE. A lot of the kids can name their favorite female athletes, and I'll ask them to raise their hands and tell me somebody that they admire who's a woman athlete, and they'll never run out of ideas. I said, well, that's a change. Back in 76, when these women were coming along, I think kids in middle school, especially the boys, would have had a hard time naming a woman athlete that they really looked up to. Even the women on the 76 team talked about how they had very few female role models, or Nancy Lieberman and Myers both would talk about trying to go to the library at their school and find a book about a woman athlete, and that maybe there'd be a book about Babe Diedrichson, but that was about it, and so I think the kids are surprised in that respect. The older kids seem to understand the idea, like I said, of this relay and the baton being passed to them, and they're aware of the inequities. A lot of times they'll point out the video from the NCAA basketball tournament a couple of years ago and the disparity in the weight rooms. And so that's an opportunity to talk about platforms, and that story, I mean, that probably that inequity had existed for a long time, but thanks to social media and taking that video, it was so glaring. Like, how could you dispute that? How could you not try to address that? And so it's a really powerful example that everyone has a chance to speak up, because you might see something like that. And if you do, let the world know about it, and maybe things could change.
So, Andrew, you're being super positive, as you always are, but I want to know in your research what really made you angry.
That's a good point. Good question. I mean, just thinking about that, and it was a point made by someone else, not me, but I think I quoted it in the book. Like, if we say that sports are valuable because they teach lessons like teamwork and hard work and dedication and overcoming obstacles, and like they, in the best sense, like what does sports do that's good, for an individual or humanity. The idea that we said, okay, but that's only for half the people, I mean, that's just so outrageous that it made me angry. And I know that for men, like when you talk about women's issues, it's not a good idea to say, oh, well, it made me think about my daughter, it made me think about my mom. Like, you should be thinking about these things anyway, right? Whether you have that personal connection or not. But I do have a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son, and of course I want them to have the same opportunities to be whoever they want to be, and the fact that there are these artificial restrictions on women athletes then, or any restrictions on women, of course, today in so many areas. I mean, that makes me angry. I love my kids equally, and we should love everybody equally, so there should be none of these artificial restrictions. And that's what probably made me the most angry when I was researching this book.
Lots of great characters, lots of amazing women. Do you have a favorite? Do you have one that really sticks with you and you love to people to point out?
Yeah, it's hard to have a favorite. I mean, there were so many amazing women on this team. I mentioned Julian Simpson, the co-captain. She's hilarious, from New Jersey, and has that New Jersey swagger, and certainly showed that off when we were in Michigan. Carolyn, who I was just with in Michigan, who didn't even make the team, but as a key character in the book, because I wanted people to relate to the women that get cut, at the end of that training camp also. She's from East Tennessee and has that real strong Southern twang. So, and that sort of down home sensibilities, and she was amazing. Of course, I didn't get to interview Pat Summitt, passed away, but she was the other co-captain on the team, and what a strong personality she was. Nancy Lieberman, Lucy Harris, who has finally started to get the recognition that she deserves and was the subject of the Oscar-winning short documentary last year. Ann Myers has been incredibly kind to me. And so it's impossible for me to say a favorite, although I think that meeting Millie Barnes was really cool. Like I said, she's in her 90s. We did an event together at the University of Central Missouri where she was the coach and where they ran the training camp for the 76 Olympics. And when I went up there to do the event, like, everyone in town knows her. They all admire her. She was driving me around. She was about to drive from Missouri to Florida for the winter by herself in her 90s. Like I said, she beats everybody in pickleball. She's just like a force of nature, and it was a really fun experience to be around her in Missouri.
My favorite were the nuns from Immaculata.
All right. Yeah. Banging on their buckets. What a scene that was. It's so fun to watch those old films of their games, and the women playing in those frocks that they had to, and being the best team in the country under those circumstances. Pretty remarkable.
Speaking of fun, it was fun for us when we flipped one of the pages and discovered that one of our own Shuklistanis, who's been on the show, John McLeod, was interviewed for this book. It was really great how you added so much color to life at the 1976 Olympics and life in the village. How did you find him? What was it like to interview him?
Yeah, so John was a water polo player from Canada, and I felt it was important in the book, since the Olympics were in Montreal, to have some of the Canadian perspective on the games, even apart from describing what it was like in the village. He had done an oral history that I found somewhere, and so I could tell that he was like a really good storyteller. And I had interviewed a couple other Canadian Olympic officials or historians, and I think it was one of them that got me in touch with him. But John just had the best stories about what it was actually like to be living in the village, and some of his teammates trying to pick up, women in the village sitting near the bar, or one of his teammates had a girlfriend that he would sneak out his window at night in the village to go see her. The practical jokes that they would play on their coach, which were out of this world crazy. Saran wrap on the door so he'd walk into it, and stuffing things under his mattress, and all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, on the eve of competing at the highest level, they're taking the time to pull practical jokes on their coach. And then he also talked about just the observations he made in the dining hall and that he was noticing how people from different parts of the world eat and how they chew their food, and when you find someone that is paying attention to that level of detail and has a great memory, and what color that adds to a story, and he told me that they would go down right before the cafeteria closed and get steak sandwiches, and sit around late at night eating those. And so I really, in all my books, especially when there's teenagers reading them, who sometimes are told that nonfiction is boring, like I want to disabuse them of that as much as I can. I think that it's those colorful little details that make you feel like you're really there, that make nonfiction the most fun type of writing. And so that's what I'm always looking for. And John definitely delivered on that.
Did you go up to Montreal at all as part of your research, or were you able to, given the time frame of when you wrote this and when travel restrictions from the pandemic were in place?
Yeah, that's a good point. So with this book, all of my interviews were done over the phone or Zoom. It was really the worst part of COVID, and I wasn't really looking to travel, and a lot of people didn't want me to come see them. So it was mostly virtual. John was a phone call. I have been to Montreal though, and it was just prior to when I started working on this book. And so just being a sports fan, I really wanted to see the Olympic Stadium, and just sort of get the lay of the land about how the Olympics was when I was there. So I at least had that background, but I really didn't do much traveling for this book, which for most of my books, I do quite a bit of. So I missed that. On the other hand, sometimes it's hard to schedule an in-person visit, and you take a long time trying to find a time that works for everybody. And or before COVID, some people had never done Zoom before, and now they had, so in some ways it made the research a lot easier. But I think you do miss something when you're not standing in the spots that you're writing about.
Well, I gotta say, if you ever go back, I love the part where you talked about how everybody was crammed into one or two rooms in the village, because
Yeah.
I went one year and was able to Airbnb an apartment in the village,
Wow.
and just the visual of these enormously tall women, save Nancy Lieberman, crammed into one of these apartments was just mind blowing to me.
I mean,
So
I would love to hear more about that. I mean, like for the listeners who haven't read, I mean, yeah, the whole team and their coaches were in one 2-bedroom apartment with bunk beds, I guess, stuffed into the corners, one bathroom for the whole team. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that must have been. And, it gets to really understanding the differences between then and now also. The basketball teams, men and women, are so popular now that they don't typically even stay in the village, even if they had their own apartments. They're off on a yacht somewhere these days, typically, because they're such big celebrities.
Do we want to take some questions?
ask your one question.
Oh, chapter 16 is called Young, Scrappy, and Hungry. Is that because the tournament was in Hamilton?
Yes, it is.
I got it right away. That's the
All right.
one note that I said, oh, we're talking to Andrew. He did this, and I love him for that.
Yeah, absolutely is why I did that. And I was hoping, only 2 people, you're like the second person that's caught it. So I'm glad that you did.
There's not enough crossover between Olympic basketball reading and show tunes. And I
That's
think
right.
that we need to bring it together.
Yeah, I was just trying to address a need there. Yeah.
Questions? Do you have questions?
I have a question. I'm curious about the process you go through to write one of these kinds of books. You had mentioned looking back at game film, and doing interviews, of course, but what other kinds of things do you do as you start to kind of get started with the research to put together a book like this?
Yeah. Well, I think that with all of my books that the research is the most important part by far. Like even more important than the writing is finding the information. Every single sentence has to come from some research that you've done, and so I tend not to be in a big hurry to start writing. Like I feel the writing suffers when you don't have enough. And so interviews are, I think, the most important part. And so for this book, I started with the obvious of the roster of the team and trying to find connections to at least a couple of the players through people that I knew, and then asking those players if they would be willing to introduce me to some of their teammates. Through old newspaper articles, I was able to find the names of the women who had been invited to the training camp, but didn't make the team. And I thought that they would have an interesting perspective and really help me be able to write, which I thought was the most fun part of the book, was writing about the training camp in Warrensburg, Missouri. For the women who didn't make the team, they would really remember that camp. If you made the team, you might forget about the camp. And sorry about the dog there. Your memories might be more about Montreal. Like, what do you care about the training camp when you've been to the Olympics? But if the training camp was as far as you got, so I think I got my best stuff about what that camp was really like from the women who were cut, and also from this kid named Vic Bozarth, who was just living in Warrensburg at the time and stumbled into the gym and saw the Olympic tryouts. Thankfully, his name wasn't John Smith, so I was able just to Google and find a couple of Vic Bozarths in the world, and found the guy that was there. And then he was interviewed for the Kansas City paper by Lloyd Grove, who went on to become a pretty well-known political writer. So I was able to find Lloyd. It's just become sort of like a web of connections that get you to the next person, to the next person. I was looking for other Olympians in other sports to help just describe the village and just the vibe in Montreal. And so the LA 84 Foundation has really good oral histories from California Olympians. And so that's how I was able to find Tana Vandeweghe. She had done an interview there, one of the swimmers, and then I got in touch with her and followed up. There have only, compared to other Olympics, there haven't been that many books written about the Montreal Olympics. So I found 2 or 3 and read those. There's been a couple of books about Nadia, and so I read those. Found the local, I live in Nashville, and Pat Head, being from this area and already being the head coach at the University of Tennessee, she was basically doing a diary in the local paper here from the Olympics, calling back, and a reporter was writing it for her, but it was based on her contemporaneous thoughts about what was happening. So that was really helpful. She's written 3 books, or she wrote 3 books with Sally Jenkins, and so those were great to read. But it's just a combination of interviews, old articles, spending a lot of time in archives, reading books. And so then I've got all the material, and then it becomes a matter of organization. Usually I'll create a 1-page outline for the entire book, just so I can kind of figure out in my head, okay, how is this going to flow? How am I going to introduce different characters? And then each individual chapter, I'll write a much longer outline, reminding myself, from describing a game against Japan. Okay, here are the articles I have about that. Here are the interviews that I've done related to that. Maybe here's even pictures so I can describe what the uniforms look like, or, that the Japanese point guard had pigtails, or certain videos that are helpful. And so those longer outlines really save me. They take a lot of time to do, but they save me time when it becomes to write. I just follow the outline, and it helps me avoid writer's block because I know exactly where I'm going.
Other questions? Patrick?
Yeah, the hat I'm wearing, I don't know if you know, I'm a Cal State Fullerton alum.
All right, that's great.
And I knew about Billy Moore and Nancy Dunkel, and I should have known, because I don't know if I even told you guys this. In my previous life, I was the Cal State Fullerton women's basketball play-by-play broadcaster for 4 years. So, but I didn't really know about the history. I was just like, oh, they're classic, the coach and player. Back in the day, I didn't really know about their history, especially with the '76 Olympic team. What were your impressions about those 2 specifically?
Yeah, that's a great connection you have there. I didn't know what the F was for. Billy Moore, I was able to interview for the book. She just passed away a couple months ago. And when I first got in touch with her, she said that she felt like her players had not gotten the respect or the attention that they deserved, and she would do anything she could to help. And what a great thing to hear from the coach of the team, So she did several interviews with me over the phone and would vouch for me with some of her players, and help me get in touch with them. She was interested in how the book was coming along. She was able to read it and see it. And I heard it was on her bedside table, when she passed away. And so that was really touching to me, that it meant something to her. She was a great storyteller. I love that she was from Kansas also, and when she told me the connection to Fog Allen, I was totally blown away. So as a young girl, she played basketball. Her dad was a coach. She developed a bad back. And so her dad took her to Lawrence, Kansas to see the top osteopath in the state. And his name was Dr. Allen. And it was Fog Allen, who was the one person most responsible for basketball, men's basketball, even being in the Olympics. You know, it was his lobbying that got basketball in the 36 Olympics. And then he literally touches, you know, the girl that would go on to become the woman that coaches the first women's Olympic basketball team. He was also the coach at Central Missouri, where the women's basketball training camp took place. So there's a lot of interesting connections there. She was a tough coach, you know, and she could kind of laugh about it in retrospect, but she said off many times, I think my players probably thought I was trying to kill him, and they might have been right, you know. And but she was a great coach. Pat Summit, I think, would say that she really patterned herself after Billy Moore. Billy knew that they weren't the tallest team or the most athletic team, most skilled team, but she said that there's one thing we can control is that we can be in the best shape of any team in those Olympics. And so she drove her players to achieve that. So I really admired what she was able to do. I know she had a lot of pressure on her with this being the first team. And, you know, so many people, so many men in the U.S., like not quite sure how they felt about women's basketball. You know, they had a lot to lose, but a lot to gain. Nancy Dunkel was one of the few women on the team that I wasn't able to interview for the book. And having just been with Julian and Carolyn, they don't know where she is. She's kind of fallen off the grid to some extent. And so I regretted I wasn't able to talk to her, but she was quoted in, you know, a decent number of articles from the past. And so I was able to get her voice in there a little bit, you know, and of course interviewed her teammates about what she was like. And she was apparently a very funny person. So there's a couple stories that when they went on some international trips, and the U.S. team would have to walk around the court kind of waving at the fans, and fans are yelling at them. But Nancy said, well, I assume they're just cursing at us, you know, so let's curse back at them. So sort of under their breath, while the women were waving, they were swearing at the fans that were being hard on them in some of the venues they played in South America.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure we find out what is next for you.
All right. So what is next for me is a series of books for young kids, like first graders, who are just getting into reading chapter books. It's called Beyond the Game. And the series will be focusing on athletes who have done some good for the world outside of their sport. And so I've written the first two, which will come out at the same time next spring. The first is on Maya Moore and the fact that she quit the WNBA at the height of her career to help get a man out of prison. Second book will be on LeBron James and starting the school in Akron, his hometown. Third book will be on Pat Tillman, the NFL player who was killed by friendly fire in Afghanistan. And then the fourth book, I don't know yet who the subject will be. So I have a little bit of time, but hopefully first graders will be marching to bookstores, buying these books, and the series will live on, you know, but we're going to see how the first four do. As far as a more adult book or young adult book, I don't have the subject yet. So I've got my eyes open and thinking about it. So if anybody has any ideas that they don't want to write themselves, I'm all up for it. What is it, Claire?
When we were starting to look for Paralympic books, I know it was a big struggle to find anything on just the general history of how the Paralympics really got started, and just an accessible book about that early history would be amazing. Yeah. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, no, that's a good idea. My agent and I, that's one thing that he mentioned too, was Paralympics. So trying to find, you know, what's the story that would allow you to tell the whole thing. But also in reading about it, I was interested in this idea of like inspiration porn, they call it, you know, and like, look at this person, how could they have done this, you know, and don't we admire them like overcoming this obstacle, and like trying not to make it a cliche. But I'm sure there's some terrific stories there. I think that's a great idea.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. We will look forward to the new series, and, you know, maybe there's another Paralympic book out there coming our way. So, thank you again Inaugural Ballers is available now. We have put we'll put an affiliate link to purchase it in the comments of this video. And thank you everyone for joining us. And reminder that new episodes of Keep the Flame Alive drop every Thursday on flamealivepod.com. So thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, keep the flame alive.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks.